Hello, everyone. My name is Mr. Al-Kabudi, Program Manager of the Canadian Accessibility Network. On behalf of CAN and our event co-host, Statistics Canada, I would like to welcome you all to today's CAN Connect Forum, titled Empowering Journeys, Embracing Accessibility for Collective Success. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the Carleton University campus and the CAN National Office here in Ottawa are located in the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And we are grateful to live and work in this beautiful territory. I'd like to share a brief physical description of myself. I am a man in my 30s. I have brown curly hair and a light beard. Today, I'm wearing a button up shirt and a blue blazer. I'm also wearing eyeglasses. I'm speaking to you today from my office at the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. We have a few housekeeping items to share with you before we start our exciting panel discussion. The Canadian Accessibility Network, or CAN, is a national collaboration under the leadership of the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. CAN aims to advance accessibility for persons with disabilities in Canada. CAN is a bilingual network. The event today, however, will be delivered primarily in English, captioning in both English and French, ASL and LSQ interpretation, and simultaneous live audio translation will be available throughout the event so that you can follow along in your preferred language. Introducing our ASL and LSQ interpreters is always a good reminder for myself and for our guests to try to speak at an even, moderate pace, not too quickly, so they can capture everything that's been said. Any attendees who indicated they required ASL and LSQ when registering for this event have been given multi-pin privileges so that you can pin each of the ASL and LSQ interpreters' videos. Pinning highlights their video on your individual screen. We'll also be spotlighting our interpreters' videos throughout the event today, and we'll do our best to ensure the active interpreters are always on the screen. There are two ways to view the captions. The first way is to enable subtitles within Zoom. You can do this by clicking on the up arrow next to the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Then click View Subtitles or View Full Transcript. The second way is through external links. We'll be sharing two links in the chat that will open in a separate window with the full transcript. There is one link for the English transcript and one link for the French transcript. For those who would like to listen to the event entirely in French or entirely in English, you can select interpretation, the globe icon in the Zoom meeting controls at the bottom of your screen, and select either the French or English language channel. You'll be able to hear the translated audio and also the original audio at a lower volume. If you cannot see the captions or encounter any technical issues during the session, please put a comment in the chat and a member of our event support team will do our best to help you. For attendees who are joining us over the phone today, the controls you can use to interact with us during the meeting are *6 to mute or unmute yourself, *9 to raise and lower hand. And our last housekeeping note, for those who use screen reader or voiceover supports, we've been made aware that commentary and activity in the chat can be distracting and take away from our speakers. It is for this reason that we've adjusted our chat settings today. You will only be able to chat directly with our event support team, who will be monitoring the chat and keeping an eye out for any questions or relevant comments. Thank you for your understanding. Any updates on the status of Tony before we proceed? Like Megan, Satkan team.
Mastur, we'll get you to get started with the panelist introductions, please.
Okay. All right, so we'll get started. Our goal today is to take a moment to pause, reflect, and acknowledge the progress that's been made in dismantling barriers and fostering opportunities for persons with disabilities, which is an especially timely conversation in light of the upcoming 5-year review of the Accessibility Canada Act. And so, today we're going to hear from a few amazing individuals who are willing to share some important moments from their own journeys that highlight and demonstrate the impact that embracing accessibility can have, not just on individual experiences, but also in driving change on a larger scale. It is my absolute pleasure today to introduce our panelists, and we will be waiting until Tony joins to introduce Tony, the chair of the panel today. So we have 3 panelists, and I would like to start by introducing Dr. Jessica Young, Dr. Jessica Ward King, Nicole and Sancho Anglu, and Nicole. So back and Nicole. Sorry, I don't have your last name. So go ahead. I will give you the floor to start and introduce yourselves. Nicole, please go ahead first.
Merci, Mastur. The pronunciation is Bekzadeh. I know it's a hard one. I apologize. Blame my husband. It's not my fault. So my name is Nicole Bekzadeh. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to this great group today and sharing some of my experiences. Just to describe myself, I am a Black woman. I have short-ish black hair that's currently in twists, and I'm wearing, I think it's a green turtleneck kind of shirt. I'm not good with my colors, and the lighting is kind of skewed. I currently work with the Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada, and I'll pass as an HR analyst, and I'll pass the mic over to Sancho.
If you don't mind, Sancho, I would like, if possible, if Dr. Jessica Ward King to go ahead, and then yeah.
Sure, I'll go ahead next. So my name is Jessica. I am a middle-aged woman with short reddish-brown hair that is swept to the side and spiky right now. I am wearing a striped green and purple sweater with a green scarf around my neck. And yes, I got the green memo from Nicole today. And I am wearing glasses as well, and I am a white woman. I also work for the Treasury Board Secretariat, incidentally, and I am a senior policy and research analyst. And then I get to pass the mic over to Sancho.
Merci finalement. OK. Je m'appelle Sancho.
Thank you. My name is Sancho Angulo. I'm a Filipino man. My hair is black. I'm wearing metal framed glasses and a blue and green check shirt. I'm talking to you from the headquarters of the Treasury Board Secretariat. I am an advisor on interim engagement with the Accessibility Office at the Treasury Board Secretariat. I'm also an instructor on contracts at the Public Service School and the Public Policy School of Carleton University, where I teach a privacy course at the master's level. It is a real pleasure to be with you here today.
Welcome all. Thank you for joining us today. So Tony approached the Canadian Accessibility Network team with this amazing idea for this event. And if for those of you who don't know Tony, Tony is the Director General of the Justice, Diversity, and Population Statistics Branch and Executive Champion for Persons with Disabilities at Statistics Canada. Tony is also the Canadian Accessibility Network's Governing Council Vice Chair and Chair of the CAN Advisory Council. However, and for technical issues, Tony is being late to this, to the panel. On his behalf, I would like to invite Jeremy to join us and moderate this panel. Jeremy, take it away. Please introduce yourself and then take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Mestul. Can everybody hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. And again, Tony apologizes. Tony's having some quite serious technical issues this morning, and a whole host of IT has not been able to fix it. So if Tony joins, it'll be a little bit late. So apologies. Je vais m'introduire.
I will introduce myself. My name is Jeremy Clones. I'm manager of the Accessibility Secretariat at Statistics Canada. I'm a white man with gray hair, wearing a pink shirt, a blue tie, and I'm wearing a tie with camels on it. I will quickly introduce this event before we begin the roundtable discussion.
Tony talked with us about organizing this panel back in the fall. He wanted to take it from the perspective of what were the points in your lived experience with facing barriers that you decided that you weren't just going to, you were going to survive and thrive almost because of it, not despite it. I know myself growing up, I've severely injured in ways that led to me being permanently chronically disabled today and in chronic pain. And I was experiencing acute, terrible depression and failing in my studies. And I was actually helped, and actually one of my favorite disability stakeholders at the time, the National Education Association of Disabled Students, at the time in the late '90s, they and the McGill Association of Disabled Students provided me a lifeline and showed me that there was life after severe injury, and there was life with disability, and that and Tony just entered, but I'll continue. Tony is joining us slowly, and en français, on dit c'est un moment déclencheur.
So, in French, we say it's a trigger point.
Despite all the barriers in my path, I'm going to succeed, and I'm going to thrive. And Tony, of course, Tony in his 30 plus year career here at Statistics Canada. I mean, he talked about this very passionately with us. But what was the point in his life when, as a person who faced a lot of barriers due to disability, basically decided that he was going to absolutely succeed despite all the barriers in his path. And it's not easy, right? For me myself, I can't really lift anything or move heavy objects, or can't move very fast. And there was a time back in 20 years ago when you move offices and someone throws a heavy box at you and says, "Hey, Jeremy, catch!" Right? We got to move. We're moving offices, and that would lend me in chronic pain for 4 weeks, or not able to move for 3 months. Things like this happened, right? And these are the things that you have to, il faut passer à travers. You have to get through some of these things and educate people around you as to the barriers.
So he said you have to go through that, and I'm repeating after him that we have to go through those barriers.
And trying to explain to people how many spoons you have, right? Anybody heard of the spoons theory? You have a certain amount of spoons for your day, and especially it's once you use them up, you have no more. You have no more energy. You have no more capacity to cope. And as a person who suffers from chronic pain, how do you conserve enough spoons, so to speak, to get through all the parts of your day, the meetings, the presentations, taking care of your children, these sorts of things before you fall down and succeed in your career, your life as a father is your life as a volunteer, as a partner. And you could decide to give up, right? Or you could decide that I'm going to do it despite all the odds, and I'm going to succeed. And the three people that we've invited today, Jessica Ward King, Sancho Angelo, and Nicole Bedzeke. Did I get that right, Nicole? I probably, you'll correct me again. This is not good. Are examples to me of people who have taken just these enormous steps in their lives to succeed and to thrive despite many challenges thrown in their path. And so I think we'll get actually started right away. Tony, just before we get going, Tony, I see that you've joined. I don't know if your technical problems permit you. Est-ce que tu veux dire quelques mots avant qu'on commence avec la table
Would you like
ronde?
to say a few words before we start with the round table, Tony?
I think we might proceed. I think we might proceed. But Tony is here with us and listening. Au minimum, Tony ici. So again, these are one of the things that I discovered with my lived experience was that I had to advocate for myself. Right, I had to, when there was an event, a workplace event where we all had to go geocaching on the side of a mountain. That was a workplace event a decade ago. And I couldn't do that, right? And so I had to advocate for. I mean, they still did it, but that was one of the first times where I'm like, hey, if we're going to do an inclusive workplace event, I need to stand up and say, maybe we need to have a couple of different events, or maybe we need to change what we do to be more accommodating, because there were other colleagues that stayed behind with me as well. Colleagues who had various physical various physical barriers. I had a colleague with advanced multiple sclerosis who's like, I'm not climbing up a mountain. Are you kidding me? So these were moments where we had to, where I realized over my career that I had to advocate for myself. And the first question that we have for our panelists, Tony, when we were talking about the questions, Tony wanted to make sure we asked this question first. And I'll ask it first. We'll start with Sancho. On commence avec Sancho.
Let's begin with Sancho.
What did you discover about yourself throughout your lived experience, Sancho? And we'll ask all three of you. But Sancho, if you wanted to kick us off, what are some of the things that you've discovered about yourself through your lived experience?
Inaudible, unfortunately.
Getting off mute is hard. Oh, you're still muted, Sancho. Okay, go to someone else. Got it. Okay. So we'll go. We're all having technical issues. We'll go to Nicole. Nicole, what did you discover about yourself through your lived experience?
Thank you for the question. So my lived experience, I think I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, in the sense that I'll start with, so I come from a family of 5 children. I'm the second eldest of 5. And my brother, who is 5 years younger than me, one of my 3 brothers, has severe autism. So he is completely nonverbal. And, up until this day, he cannot speak. So my entire life, from the time as far back as I can remember, since he was, with us, is that I've always had to advocate and speak on his behalf. And I don't want to say that in the sense that, I'm this, freedom fighter. I'm so strong Black woman, always speaking up for my brother. There was challenges with this as a kid, and it's something that I slowly grew into, because there were times where I didn't have that bravery or that ability to be able to speak for him. And there were situations that occurred where, even looking back now, I have to live with, not saying the right things or not knowing what to do. And I regret those times. And it's ironic because, I was a kid when a lot of these things happened. But I think what that has done, as it has made me even more, I don't want to say brave now. And I refuse, I can't. There's times where I'm sitting in a meeting and things are happening, and I have to speak up, because my experience has been growing up with a brother with autism that can't speak for himself, seeing situations where, either people or individuals were taking advantage of his situation, or seeing how the system that we find ourselves was not designed for him to thrive. When we talk about things like ableism, systemic racism, and all these other isms, what they all come down to is we're living in a system that was pretty much designed for a certain type of person, able-bodied, let's face it, probably at one point in time a certain race, and everybody else kind of was on the fringes. And the further and further you are from that prototype person that a lot of our systems were built for, the more and more difficult things are. And I've witnessed that growing up from one lens, having a brother with severe autism, and from the other lens of being racialized, and seeing how there were, maybe even help that he could have received as a child that he didn't get because of our socioeconomic status. So I think that has taught me about myself that being silent in a lot of things isn't an option. And it's also forced me for, like I said, most of my life to look at things through somebody else's eyes. I can't make decisions or do things without considering other people. And I think it's something that I bring to my work. And I try to, think, okay, this might be the recommendation, or this might be what I'm going to do, but how does it impact other people? Because just like my brother isn't able to advocate or to speak for himself, I always think about the people who are not at the decision-making table, who are not present. And I think it's just part of who I am to always consider what are the implications, what are the ramifications about what I'm going to do or what I'm saying that we should do. So I think that's what I'll say is kind of shaped my who I am today and what I've learned through growing up with a brother with autism at a time where, like, I remember when I was growing up and people would ask, what's wrong with your brother? And I would say, well, he's autistic, we would say back then. And people were like, what's autistic? You mean he's artistic? And then I would have to go through this whole thing explaining what autism was. Like in the 90s and the 80s, nobody knew what that was. So, fast forward to today, I think there's a lot more knowledge and education around the matter. I still think there's a lot of work that we have to do to make sure that all people are truly included in society. But that's just something that I think I've learned about myself, is that because back then I was afraid, and it was almost a shame to say that I had this brother with autism. Now I'm proud, and it's something that I will always, speak up for whenever I can.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate that. Indeed, the power. I mean, the power and the need to speak up frequently and remind people. I'll turn it over to Jessica. Jessica, what did you discover about yourself through your lived experience?
For me, it was a little bit different. My lived experience is one of developing bipolar disorder when I was a teenager. And I had to learn that I didn't have to be, that I couldn't be, and didn't have to be perfect. I grew up as a child. I was very academically gifted. They wanted to skip me a grade. I was always in the gifted program. I was doing extracurriculars that were for gifted children. I was supposed to be some kind of, young genius that was going to do great things. I was going to some high-powered university. I was going to be some kind of academic or something. And when I was about 15, that's when the symptoms started, and they started with depression, with bipolar depression. And I was still able to do my schoolwork. That's a feature of my illness. I'm always still able to do my work because I'm so driven to do my work, to do my schoolwork, even now to do my work. Even when I'm in a depressive episode, I still do my work. And that's part of my drivenness to be perfect. I think I have to be the perfect, get the perfect grades, or do the perfect work, or do the perfect extracurriculars, or be the perfect daughter, whatever it is. It's got to be tip top. And when I got ill, things started to slip. I couldn't be seriously depressed and have the perfect grades and the perfect extracurriculars and be the perfect daughter and be the perfect friend. I couldn't do it all. And as much as I wanted to, they started to slip. And I thought that that meant that I was a terrible person. I thought that it was the fault of the illness, and I hated the illness for it. And I hated myself for it. For a long time, I hated myself for it, because I was no longer, because of this illness, because I got sick, because of this disability that I developed, I was no longer perfect. And therefore I was no longer going to be this genius child that I was supposed to be, this academic that I was going to be. Everything was going to fall apart. And I did go to university. I mean, I worked really hard, and I went to university, and I worked really hard when I was at university, and I got some therapy and some medication when I was there, and still didn't believe that I was going to be, this person with bipolar disorder. I just couldn't believe it. And when I went to grad school to get my PhD, it really all fell apart. That's when I ended up hospitalized. That's when I just couldn't. And I didn't achieve what I needed to achieve there. I didn't get the papers that I needed to publish. I didn't get, all of the studies that I needed to get studied. I got the PhD, but it wasn't up to snuff. But I met my wife, and she loved me anyway. And it started to click that I didn't have to be perfect. And I started therapy, and I really realized that I could be anything but perfect. I could be magnificent. I could be worthwhile. I could be remarkable. And it didn't have to be perfect. I could still fail at stuff. And so that's kind of the first big lesson that this illness, this bipolar disorder, this disability taught me, was that I didn't need to be perfect, that I couldn't be perfect, but that I could still be remarkable. I could still be something amazing. I could still be an academic if I wanted to be, which it turned out I didn't want to be. I could still be great at my job. I could still be a great mother. I could still be a great wife. I could still be remarkable. I just couldn't be perfect. And that was okay. And it was hard fought. It took me a long time to get to that place. But it was because of my bipolar disorder that I got to that place. And it's a good place to be.
Wow. Thank you, Jessica. Sorry, that was, I'm deeply moved for that. I think you speak for so many of us. I'm deeply moved by that. Thank you very much. Sancho, you've got the last word on this one.
Oui, je m'excuse pour les précédents problèmes techniques. Il me paraît
I'm
que-
sorry for these technical problems. There seemed to be a problem with my microphone, but it's all fixed now. My story begins in the Philippines.
Ma famille au Canada quand j'avais
I
3 ans.
came to Canada with my family when I was 3.
Aux Philippines.
Deep roots in the Philippines. I've always known that there was something different about me. I had difficulty making friends. I became obsessed by anything involving geography and history. When I was 4, I memorized all the capitals of all the countries in the world.
Et je suis autiste, en fait.
I'm autistic.
J'ai reçu un diagnostic de syndrome
I
d'Asperger qui fait maintenant partie
was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is now on the autism spectrum. When I was 13, that's when I got the diagnosis, but I'm also someone who fights an eating disorder, bulimia.
I was diagnosed with autism because I had a conflict with a classmate, and I was referred to a school board psychologist who, by my teachers, who felt as though I needed this, and I there was a lot of shame associated with being autistic, um, and in many ways, because my parents were surprised that I had Asperger's, a lot of the time I was told just to overcome it, that I needed to simply, work harder, um, and to really think of myself as just inherently capable, even with the challenges in social communication that came with being autistic. But I also am someone that from a very young age has struggled with my body, and in many ways, my autism and my bulimia, um, they are intertwined. I'll continue in French. J'ai réalisé à quel point que j'avais été.
In fact, they're linked to the point where I became sensitized to a great number of problems with which I perceive in my body since I was very young. My parents would call me obese. My father would even call me something, a word in Tagalog that means the fat one. I took swimming lessons. I was put in a swimming program. When you're the obese child of a volleyball varsity player, it's difficult. I told the swimming teacher that I was afraid the water wouldn't hold me up because I weighed 95 pounds. My parents would keep telling me every day what I weighed, even though that relationship between my parents and myself has improved tremendously. It still has some echoes that affect me to this day.
One of the biggest challenges for me being with someone who experiences an eating disorder and is also autistic is just how difficult it is to find help at the nexus of all those experiences you carry. I've been rejected by no less than 16 therapists, one after the other, who felt as though my case has been too complex to deal with. You sometimes have therapists that admittedly have a bit of an ego. They want to take all of your issues, and at the end of it, those how many ever sessions you have, there to be a clear glide path to resolving them. In being rejected by each of them, you feel this sense that there is something fundamentally broken about you, that not even the therapists who are there to support you can be there. And what I've realized through all of this is the inner strength that I have, the ability to keep going, even when people count things against you. I remember being part of my high school's equity council and wanting to lead. And despite being a council focused on driving equity and inclusion, I was specifically rejected from leadership positions twice as the director of that council because I was autistic. And similarly, I worked for another organization where, despite having built the organization's constitution and bylaws from the ground up, was passed over for someone who joined the organization only months after, because the prejudiced person at the helm of that organization felt that I did not have the temperament for leadership in his eyes. I've realized that resilience and strength is is something that I've had to develop in the face of not having that support. And so going at it alone has been my journey, and something that I realize I don't want anyone else to experience, which is why I guide my life right now with the idea of being who you needed when you were younger. I may not have had that support necessary in the past, but I realize that I can be that support for other people, and planting trees under whose shade you would never sit. and that kind of encapsulates my experience. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Sancho. Je vais toujours souvenir de
Thank
cette
you, Sancho. I'm always going to remember that expression.
I actually think that all three of you, thank you. Vous avez couvert notre prochaine question.
Thank you to all three of you.
Super beau.
Our next question.
And I think we've covered it a little bit as well, but I wanted to ask you, and I'll start with Jessica this time. And Jessica, you touched on it a little bit durant votre présentation. Vous avez touché un peu sur celle-là.
You did touch on this question a little bit in your own comments.
Certain abilities, because of your situation, certain unique abilities, certain mechanisms that are there things that you have developed in order to push back some of the barriers that you face? I'd be really curious to know that.
Yeah, for me, this one took a while to develop. I could have used it a lot in my earlier years, but I started out with my illness very highly self-stigmatized. There's a lot of stigma around mental illness, I'm sure everybody knows, which is, that feeling of shame that surrounds the particular item, so the illness, in this case, mental illness. There can be stigma around a lot of things. There's stigma around, for example, menstruation. There's stigma around HIV and AIDS. There's stigma around a lot of things, but there's a lot of stigma around mental illness, and particularly serious mental illness like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. There's a lot of a fear around, are you stable? Are you going to be violent? There's a lot of linkage between mental illness and violence, and that adds to the stigma. And for me, I was self-stigmatizing, which means that I was having stigma against my own mental illness, and having that shame and that hatred towards myself and towards my own experience and my own living and lived experience of that illness. And it was so bad. It was to the point that I refused help for the first almost 10 years of living with this illness. And it can have some very severe symptoms. And so I was living with some very severe depression, and then highs of mania, and which can cause, some lapses in judgment, some questionable behaviors, and even to the point of having psychosis and delusions and hallucinations and things like that. So there can be some serious symptomatology, suicidal ideation, and yet I was refusing help. There were people offering help, saying, why don't you come in and get some counseling? Why don't you try some medication? And I was refusing. I would, absolutely deny that I had a mental illness. I would just, think that I was going through a rough patch, or, the mental illness couldn't possibly be me. And the reason that I was thinking that is because people with mental illness are, stupid, they're lazy, they're sucks on the system, they're violent, they're the ones that, just get their disability checks and go to walk-ins and just, waste their lives away. All of those things that we tend to associate with mental illness when we are stigmatizing. And so I thought, those things could not possibly be me, because remember, I was going to be this genius academic type. I couldn't possibly be one of those stupid, lazy sucks on the system, one of those people. So that stigma was with me, and it was really damaging my life. It was damaging my relationships. It was damaging, my happiness, the way that I was able to move forward in my life.
And while I was able to, kind of work my way through that one portion and, get the scholarship so I could go to university, I could do that one thing, everything else was crumbling. And so what I managed to do ultimately was I was teaching at a university and I saw a student that was just like me, self-stigmatizing, refusing help, and he died by suicide. And I saw that and I thought that could have been me, because that very nearly was me in many cases. And I saw all the students around him that were so deeply affected and deeply wounded by this. And I thought, we can't have more like this. If I spoke up, I might be able to stop this. More students might not have to die by suicide. If only people like me who'd been through this could speak up and tell about how they'd gotten through this and share the wisdom and share the learnings and maybe mentor a student. And so I kind of pushed through that self-stigma and that self-hatred, and I got up and I told my story in front of my students, in front of my colleagues. I was terrified. I thought maybe I'd lose my job, maybe I'd lose the respect of my colleagues, but I didn't want any more students to have that pain. And so I got up and told my story. And my students called me the stigma crusher because they said I crushed stigma that day. And I took on that mantle and I started to tell my story and I started to do the work. I started to crush the stigma. My illness has given me, it's given me the ability to get up and share what I've been through so that other people can learn from it, so that other people can grow from it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jessica, for being a witness. Thank you so much for that. Boy, sorry, hard to continue after hearing that, but I'm gonna ask the same question to Sancho. Sancho, did you develop certain abilities because of your unique situation?
Absolument. Et là où je n'étais pas capable d'avoir des amis, je trouvais la
Absolutely. When I couldn't find friends, I found friendship through documentaries, information, or I would switch channels between Disney and National Geographic, for instance. And I remember the high volume of information that I received. And people said that I was a walking encyclopedia, and I was able to retain like a sponge all kinds of info regarding this or that business, for instance. And as a teenager, and when I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which was diagnosed, and knowing that this terminology has changed, but that was the American or the US policy of the time. But it was strange for a 13-year-old teenager be obsessed with American politics. I knew absolutely everything about US politics, the federal administration. I was watching obsessively CNN. And my teacher in 8th year said, well, that they should promote this interest of mine. And then that drew us to follow very closely the American election, or for instance, Gingrich's victory in Georgia. So that's how I became very, very obsessed. And then it enabled me to get a Fulbright scholarship in the state of New York State in Plattsburgh. And in spite of the fact that I'm a Canadian, I got the the best grade in that state of New York.
You know, in rotating so much information, I've also realized the importance of taking that information and having it become action. And so as an autistic person, there were many days in which, you know, people would talk about me, you know, about, even though I was in the room and would hear talk over me, they would try to advocate for me without consulting me. And it was really frustrating. It was frustrating in the sense that I felt like I did not have a voice. And that's not to say that there are those who are autistic who may struggle to advocate for themselves. But to paint everyone with the same brush proved very difficult for me growing up. And so standing up for myself and developing a strong sense of justice was always very important for me. And it's one of the beautiful things that came about. In fact, the reason why Infinity is the network for neurodivergent public servants. It is the largest government-wide neurodiversity network in the G7, with over 1,000 members across 80 institutions of government. We serve to empower and to advance neurodivergent people across the federal public service. And this was founded because of a case in which I applied to, if you are in government land, EC5 or 6 positions, despite having many years of experience in the federal government and having a master's degree under my belt. I disclosed that I was autistic in my CV. And this led this hiring manager to reply with what was essentially baby talk. She spoke to me as though I was a helpless child that didn't know what I was doing, even though I had a master's, 2 degrees in public policy by that time. And she even said to me explicitly, I would be at a disadvantage to qualify for that position. And I know that while that was couched in language around you don't have enough experience, I don't imagine I would have been treated that way had I been autistic. And that moment made me realize this is probably not what this is probably the rule, not the exception for persons with disabilities and neurodivergent people within government. And so I took it upon myself to say, I will not let this slide. I will not let this continue to be the rule. And so I founded Infinity. And I think because of that commitment to a sense of justice and having a voice, I've more than risen above this hiring manager's low expectations of me. So that's kind of what I'll say there.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sancho. I really appreciate that. Again, your witness, and thank you all as well for your leadership. I've joined Infinity myself, and I love being amongst like-minded and like situation people. The Discord chat's all such a fun. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to move to the last question so we can get to the Q&A, and I'm going to ask it first to Nicole. Nicole, are there behaviors from the people around you that make you and your brother and you mentioned your children and make you and them feel included? What can we learn from those positive and inclusive behaviors that you see around you? And if you haven't seen them, what are the behaviors that you'd be looking for, right? What are the types of allyship behaviors around you that you need for more support? But first, let's talk about perhaps the behaviors, the inclusive behaviors that you see around you.
Thank you for the question. I think a lot of progress has been made. When I look at, because I'm a mother of 4 children now, one of which has a learning disability. And when I compare her experience from what I've seen as an observer in the school system compared to what I saw my younger brother go through in the 80s and 90s in the school system, I think that there has been progress in terms of inclusion. I think there's been progress in terms of inclusion in the workplace because people are a little bit more aware, as I gave in my example, where people at least know what autism is now versus 20, 30 years ago, no one even knew what it was. Anecdotally, I can tell you an experience that I had in 6th grade. I can still remember, sitting in a classroom and my teacher was giving a lesson. I think it was a religion class, and I can't remember what they were talking about, but somehow we were talking about people with disabilities. And the teachers, and I remember raising my hand and saying, well, my brother can't speak, he has a disability. And the teacher in front of the whole class said, oh, you mean he's dumb? And I'm like, no, he's not dumb. He has autism. And the teacher repeated, well, he's dumb. He can't speak. He's dumb. And this is me, grade 6, and you have this person in authority telling you that your younger brother is dumb. Like that pretty much is a microcosm for what my experience in elementary school was. Fast forward to today, I certainly hope nobody in authority would make such a statement like that. So I think that there has been steps taken. However, I will caveat that with, I think that there is a layer that we often miss in society, particularly in the public service. And I think the layer that I'm speaking of is I feel like people with disabilities, people from different backgrounds that are in lower socioeconomic classes or brackets are often forgotten and neglected. I think a lot of policies that come out of the government, a lot of steps that we take to include people are ignoring a large cohort of people that are not in the middle and upper class. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of programs that my family did not have access to in the 80s and the 90s. And I saw how this had a very negative effect on our socioeconomic placement. There were no childcare options for my brother. There was always somebody that had to be home with him, whether that was a parent, whether that was me as a sibling that was only 5 years older than him. He had to be under constant care, and this caused significant financial hardship on our family. I witnessed, fast forward to when I had my own child with a disability, which was not as severe as my brother. And I noticed and I experienced significant financial hardship trying to navigate the system, trying to get help for her. So as much as there are lots of organizations right now that have programs for families with children, with people that have disabilities, I often find that they don't do a very great job recognizing that not everybody has a car to get to these places or someone who can drive them. Sometimes the timing for some of these programs assume that people work a 9-to-5 job and can come after work. My parents work shifts. I'm sure a lot of people might have parents or be in similar situations. I can remember even with my own daughter being told in order to get into a program for her, you had to attend an information session without the child that had the disability. Well, I had to work. My husband was working, and that session was in the evening, which I guess, okay, fine. We were lucky enough to work a 9-to-5. But he also worked a shift in the evening. I didn't have childcare. Or sometimes I can distinctly remember them saying, both parents have to attend. So what are we supposed to do with the kid, right? I mean, we didn't have, like my parents were still working, we didn't have childcare. So things like that, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think the awareness is there, and I think that there's programs and activities and steps being taken to be more inclusive and to recognize that not everybody is the same. But I think we often have to remember, and this is something that I constantly do, coming from that working class background, is when we say things or we do things or we try to make new programs, are we making them truly inclusive? How accessible are those programs even for accessibility? And unfortunately, sometimes I find that they are not. And the last thing I'll say is there's also the lens of inclusion in terms of there's a socioeconomic lens, but I think there's also an ethnicity and a racial component as well. We know that in certain communities, there are stigmas attached to certain diagnoses. And there also is, are we promoting, are we talking about these things in a way that everybody is going to understand? And if there are stigmas attached to certain conditions, are we doing what we need to do in order to make communities aware that they might even be experiencing these things that we're having these programs for? I don't know if that makes sense, but I know for me, particularly in the communities that I'm from, the challenge was once we had the diagnosis for autism, because there was a stigma around that, there was a real hesitation even for my parents, for my mother to want to pursue, you know, activities and care, even up until today for him, because they don't want that perception that there's something, you know, quote unquote wrong with their son. And, you know, the other thing we have to look at is how these things impact not just the individual, but the families of the individual, the friends of the individual, the colleagues of the individual. We can't only put the burden on the person. I think we all have work to do to make sure that we're improving things. And it can't just be as if the person is the problem and everybody else has to do something. I think we should all be doing the work. And it's not just the role of the employer to have training programs. People can pick up a book, you can Google. Maybe I can excuse that teacher 30 years ago for calling my brother dumb. There was no internet. But I think in 2024, you know, there's no excuse for that anymore.
No, there isn't. Thank you, Nicole, very much. Yeah, I can relate. I have two children with ADHD, and having the both parents should attend parent-teacher conference at 7 in the evening when when you know, that's the point where you have to wind the children down so that they'll actually go to sleep, because of those people who children who have acute don't fit in the box syndrome, which I like to call it, you know, wonderfully helpful, fantastic timing. Yeah, but we've made progress, but it's been tough. We're going to we have just a few minutes before we start the Q&A portion of the event, and also I'll ask the same question to Sancho. Je vais demander la même question à Sancho. Sancho, est-ce qu'il y a des comportements des peuples autour de toi?
Are there behaviors around you that made you feel more accepted, welcomed, included? And what could we learn from that?
Yeah, so I'll speak in English just so it's quicker for me to respond. So the first thing I'll say is say what you mean what you say. Clear communication is important to everything, and it drives cognitive accessibility within our organizations. Being able to understand something like sarcasm or euphemisms might be very difficult for someone who is autistic. So it's really important to be mindful of how, you know, using things like let's put a pin in it might be misinterpreted by someone who is autistic. And so the next thing I would say is to expand your idea of what accessibility is. We've done a lot to advance accessibility when it comes to physical, sight, and other mobility disabilities, but it's important to be mindful that cognitive accessibility is really important. If you have a conference and one, you can have ramps and you can have you know, tactile flooring, but if it's incredibly noisy and overwhelming, that can lead to overstimulation for a lot of folks who are neurodivergent and may have difficulty with sensory processing. The next one I'll shift this to the workplace is to challenge your idea of what the ideal employee is. There's been a really problematic tendency within organizations to hire for culture fit, someone that you could see yourself going out for a beer with. Not only do a lot of us not like beer, we have to realize that the people we work best with aren't always the people that we socialize and, you know, get along with outside of work. You know, I once read that an interview is basically a process in which you say the right words to a bunch of people at the other side of a computer screen or table, and depending on the words you say and how you say them, you're assigned a certain number of points, and whoever gets the most amount of points wins. That kind of like demystified what an interview is, because, you know, when they say we're having an informal chat, that's an interview. And all that coded language might be difficult for someone who, without that awareness, to understand that. And this is mindful of the fact that people who are neurodivergent are more likely to be underemployed or unemployed. In fact, if we look at EY, Ernst & Young, 86% of neurodivergent people are under or unemployed. That's staggering. And so maybe it's more likely than not, they will not get that, language, like what's an informal chat, or that be clear as to what you communicate. And if you are hiring a hiring manager right now, ask yourself, are your interview questions hiring for neurotypicality, or are you trying to hire the best candidate to do the job that you're looking to do? If you have situational questions, do they require that candidate to understand the social context masterfully in order to succeed in answering that question? Do you track things like how the candidate is fidgeting or their eye contact? And do you link those traits to whether or not you see them as competent? The next thing I would say as a manager is many neurodivergent employees are seen as the problem employees. And many managers get themselves into a tailspin of negativity around neurodivergent employees. You just start in, you spot one thing, and the only thing you can think about with that employee every time you think about them, every time you give them an assignment, is what are they going to do wrong? What have they done wrong? And the only thing you can think about is what are they doing wrong? When you're having those conversations, even in a team environment, when you're commiserating with other managers, interrupt that. Think about, why am I thinking this way? Why am I constantly thinking about this person in a negative way? Think about, what have they been done? What have they done right? What can they do right? What potential do they have? And the more we get ourselves out of this negative thinking around someone we see as a problem employee, who are often neurodivergent persons with disabilities, the less we have conversations that are about getting that person out and about skewering them for all the problems they have, and the more conversations we can have about what potential can we unlock when we fully integrate this person into our workforce. So that's what I'll say there.
That's fantastic, Sancho. Merci infiniment. Merci infiniment.
Oh, thank you, Sancho. That's great.
And actually, I'd appreciate talking later about questions we can use, and less neurotypical questions to use in interviews. I'd like to know more about that. Jessica, I'll let you have the last word before we go to our Q&A. Are there any behaviors from the people around you that make you feel particularly included, and what can we learn from them?
I lost your sound there on you a little bit, but
sorry, can you hear me there?
That's okay. I can hear you now, but I know the question.
Okay.
I've
okay,
got
go
you.
for it.
So for me, the real damage comes in mental health stigma, and there I see a lot of the problems, especially in the workplace, come with language. But also, also not in the workplace. It comes in language where people sometimes don't even know, sometimes should know better, with using language like, this weather is so bipolar. It's like up one day and, raining one day and sunny the next. And I've heard this one in the context in a boardroom in the workplace twice. Something like, that deputy minister is so schizophrenic. She can't make up her mind. She's here one day and here in another place another. And those kinds of uses of diagnostic phrases for mental illnesses are of course completely inappropriate. They're highly stigmatizing. They make a person who has that diagnosis, or a person who knows and loves someone with that diagnosis, feel really icky inside, because that word is used in a negative context and in a glib context. But it's not only things that are that egregious. I mean, you may think like, well, I would never say something like that. I'm good to go. No, it's also about those times when you say things like, oh my goodness, this is so crazy. He's so psycho. Things that we say fairly frequently, things that we don't even think of saying. But that are also themselves stigmatizing. And so uses of language like that those things should be stopped. And they're difficult to stop because we use them all the time, because we don't think of them. Even like, things like, oh, she's one brick short of a full load, or, oh, one flew over the cuckoo's nest there. Those kinds of turns of phrase that we don't even think of. That we need to think of, because they're damaging. They're hurtful to someone who's living with that illness, or who is loving someone who's living with that illness. And of course, 1 in 4 of us live with a mental illness. By the age of 40, half of us will have lived with a mental illness. And every single one of us loves someone with a mental illness, whether we know it or not, whether we want to admit it or not. So it's damaging to us all when those kinds of words are used. And one other thing I'll mention, and then I'll stop, is when someone has a mental health day or goes on leave that is for their mental health, it's really, really difficult because people they freeze. They don't know what to do. Should we call them? Should we send them flowers? Should we let them know what's going on in the office? You know what? No, they're off for their mental health. We'll just leave them alone entirely. We won't touch them with a 10-foot pole. And then when somebody goes off for cancer, there's casseroles, there's letters, there's emails, there's phone calls, there's flower arrangements, there's all kinds, right? But if you go off for mental health leave, don't touch them. In fact, people are afraid that labor relations will get involved if you even call them, right? So people are freaking out. Don't freak out. It's someone's gone on leave for a mental illness or for a mental health concern. That doesn't mean that they are now a radioactive bomb, right? And labor relations does not need to get involved if you want to send them an email to let them know something that's gone on in the office that pertains to them. In fact, it is kind to let a person know what is going on in the office when they are on extended leave. That is what we do, right? So those kinds of behaviors that are stigmatizing are really damaging, and I'd like to see those stop.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Merci beaucoup toutes les panélistes.
Thank you to all our panelists. What wonderful answers. I see that Tony is raising his hand. Tony, are you able to be heard now? Hello, everyone.
But I could listen to most of what was discussed while I was trying to fix technical difficulties. J'ai été très touché par les témoignages.
I was extremely touched by the testimonies and comments. I'd like to thank you, Jeremy, for having taken over as moderator. And thank you to the three panelists for sharing so much of yourself.
It takes a lot of courage to share all this information with us. And I'm very thankful. When I was thinking about this panel discussion, it was after now more than 22 years of being a champion for persons with disabilities at Statistics Canada. I'd met so many people that had embraced who they were, and as they had accepted themselves, and that they had more and more feeling of acceptance around them, I could see how they had developed or discovered abilities and became a better version of themselves. Moi-même, je suis né avec une basse vision, ça m'a pris un certain temps.
I was born with low vision, and it took me time to adjust before discovering this. It was difficult before discovering how to cope. I've become a stronger version of myself. And it's interesting to see that you have done that. We have to accept ourselves before others will accept us. There is an issue of inclusion, of course.
I've been very inspired, very touched by all the messages that were shared. So I'm looking forward to the questions we will get from the audience. But I'm extremely grateful, extremely thankful for all the things that you shared. And I think our audience will have learned a lot. And that if you also have a few more words about how the Canadian Accessibility Network can help to foster an even more accessible and inclusive Canadian society and economy. I would also like to hear from each of you, dear panelists. And again, thank you all for your understanding with because my technical difficulties were certainly not anticipated by anyone, and for your agility, Jeremy, panelists, and all the organizers. Merci.
Merci, Tony. Merci infiniment. Je vais passer
Thank
la
you so
parole
much, Tony.
I will pass,
So I'll yield the floor to Mastur.
Thank you, Jeremy, and welcome, Tony. We're glad you solved or resolved those technical difficulties. I am energized. This has been amazing. So if you have, this is to our audience. If you have any questions or comments for our panelists, please type them in the chat, and I'll read them out to Tony and our panelists. If you require ASL or LSQ interpretation to ask a question or share a comment, please raise your hand and we'll spotlight your video and invite you to sign your question. So if you're joining us by phone today, please use *9 to raise and lower hand, *6 to mute and unmute yourself. So please share your questions. So we have comments from some of our attendees that would say, I'm passing this along. They said, please tell the participants, thank you for their bravery to participate in this panel and be vulnerable. So thank you. So, and we have a question from Anna. The question is, before the questions, thank you to the panel and facilitator. What a fantastic and informative session. So I have a question for Sancho. Could you recommend any sources that detail requirements for cognitive accessibility in the built environment?
There's a lot of them, and so there's been I can certainly say there's been a lot of duplication of work across various jurisdictions. I know that there is a resource from ESDC for IT accessibility that does include some stuff for the built environment as well. There's also the neurodiversity design kit that also can feed into what sort of colors you use. I also have seen great resources from, I think the Job Accommodation Network also has some stuff in terms of what cognitive accessibility looks like in the built environment. And certainly with Infinity's work, we're plugged into a lot of that within the federal government, seeing how we can make our workplaces ones where neurodivergent people, when they come to the office, feel they can contribute their very best. So those are some examples I can think of at the top of my head right now.
Excellent, thank you. Another question for one of the panelists. So I'm quoting, thank you for this amazing session. If you are faced with a manager who penalizes you for aspects that are tied to your disability, facial expressions or tone, how would you approach the situation? This is for all panelists or any who would like to join this.
So you have a current manager who's penalizing you as a result of your disability, specifically like social aspects of your disability. That is a cause for a complaint because you are being harassed or not harassed, but because you're being discriminated against, that's the word, on account of your disability, because it's a manager who is behaving that way against you. So you could make a complaint. If you feel comfortable, and this is not required, it's not required that you go to the person that is doing this to you and speak to them. But if you feel comfortable with your manager and this is just kind of a new behavior, you could speak to your manager and kind of say, like, what's up, what's going on. And that's if you have a good relationship with your manager. If you don't, or if this is not a new behavior, this is a long-standing behavior, I would skip that step. And instead, I would go above the manager. Labor relations would be one direction you could go to get some help with that. So HR in general, because like it's not okay, right? And it's not okay to do nothing, and it's also not okay just for you to leave your job to go find somewhere else to be. This is a case where you would be totally within your rights to advocate for yourself and to stand up for yourself, and to actually make sure that the manager is held accountable for their behavior and to actually change their behavior, hopefully. So that's what I would do. I would actually go that route and make the complaint. But maybe one of the other panelists has a different experience that they could share.
Any thoughts? Yeah.
Oh,
Nicole?
I could jump in.
Yeah.
It's a tough question because you have the textbook, what I'll call, you're sitting on a selection process answer, and then you have the reality that many of us have faced when you're in these situations. You know, when was the last time you heard or you saw a manager be accountable for discriminating or harassing staff? I don't know. In my 15-year career, unfortunately, I haven't seen it happen very often. And yes, while I think more people have to call out and take steps to report these issues, I think it starts with, first of all, having an awareness and an understanding about what harassment and what discrimination is. Because one of the challenges that I've seen in my career, with myself and also when I mentor others, is people, especially whether it's racism, whether it's because you have a disability, often when you're being discriminated against in these ways, it's because you've experienced it so many times in the past that it's almost as if you've been socialized and you're accustomed to it and you kind of write it off. You're so used to being, experiencing microaggressions, you're so used to experiencing these different things that you're not even aware that it's wrong and it shouldn't be happening. So the first step that the person who posed the question has done is great, because at least they're aware that what they're experiencing is valid and it shouldn't be happening. So I think the second thing, what I've seen in my career as a public servant, is there's this fear, there's this stigma of reporting things, because number one, the culture is that people often do report things and the behavior continues and the establishment does nothing to deal with the problem. And then now you risk having to stay on in this toxic situation because you reported your manager for what they did, and nothing was done. So as much as I agree with what my colleague Jessica has said and has advised, and I do think it's important to try to address it and to report these things, my own experience has been that you might have to start looking for other options for other teams to work on, because I don't think, at least in my experience, many places that I've worked, there is a culture that is willing to hold these managers accountable, and you're going to get stuck in a toxic environment. And I think the one good thing about the public service, and one of the reasons why I came to work here, is that it's so large and there are good teams, there are good managers, there are good colleagues. So if you are in a toxic place, just start emailing, start talking, start networking, and I'm sure you can find something and somewhere that will welcome you and that will be more inclusive. And my hope, and one of the reasons why I came to work at Treasury Board, is I think there needs to be a culture change. And I think that there needs to be a culture in the government where these types of occurrences don't happen and these types of managers are not enabled to continue perpetuating these toxic work environments. And that's not something I think can be established by a victim or somebody that's experiencing these things, in an office somewhere at a lower level position. I think it behooves executives, it behooves leadership to take steps to make sure that these acts of harassment and discrimination don't continue.
I'm also tempted to add a few words, if I may, on that one. I think what we heard is very true. There's always a choice to stay or to leave, and there's a question of our own personal level of energy in addressing the situation. This is important that we're at the center of the discussion, so we get to choose if we, as an individual, want to address this. Yes, there's the possibility of talking to the person. There's the possibility of talking to the supervisor of the person. There's the possibility of talking to a union representative. There's often informal conflict management services or employee assistance program services as well. In Statistics Canada, we have 2 co-champions for persons with disabilities, and in fact, we have champions for other groups. There are also integrity and respect agents that are part of the management team. So depending on the organizations, there are a number of doors that you can knock at, and there's even other doors outside the organization, like Human Rights Commission and other organizations like this, that can provide advice depending on how severe this situation, how long lasting this situation would have been prevailing. And yes, as it was just said before my intervention, there are so many places where you can bloom and feel included. And you also have the power of your feet and to bring your talents elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That is amazing. Are there any questions? I'm asking my teams. There are so many comments in the chat, so my apologies to everyone. I'm not able to respond to everyone in the chat right now, but generally the comments are thanking the panelists and the moderators. Thank you so much. This has been great. There is a final question. There have been a few questions and comments asking for resources in the chat. Inclusive interview question list, for example, resources available for autistic adults, resources for requesting workplace accommodations, and for example, if that's a smooth process and how to go around that. And this is for everyone.
Can you repeat that question?
So many questions in the chat are asking for resources. For example, inclusive interview question list that you can ask during an interview, or resources available for autistic adults, if you know of any, and resources for requesting workplace accommodations.
I guess I could take the, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I was just having some audio issues. But this said, I'm happy to, it takes some thinking to like bring it all together, but I think in terms of in the Job Accommodation Network is a really good resource in English in terms of various accommodations. I personally recognize that, you know, the social model is great in terms of its empowerment, but it assumes that every person with a disability has perfect information about the accommodations they need. It's important to rely on resources like that. And so if it, you're welcome to email the Infinity inbox, and I can certainly put together some resources that folks might be interested in looking at in terms of their own hiring processes. But I think it really starts with, I think all of this is housed in a lot of different areas, I will admit. But I think when it comes to an accommodation and the best practices around that, neurodivergence is one of those, it's been described to me as one of the final frontiers when it comes to accessibility. So it's important. Yeah.
Thank you, Sancho.
Can I just jump in to add something?
Please, yeah.
I think we have to, I see a pattern that happens when I do these events and I'm talking about, you know, anti-racism and inclusion and whatnot. I think people are well-meaning and they ask the question for resources and these how-to guides on how not to be racist and how to be inclusive. And I know I have a bias because I grew up with a brother with autism. I'm a Black woman. I get it. But even though I do belong to those groups, I spend a lot of time taking time to learn about groups that I'm not a part of. Whether that's learning about Indigenous culture, Indigenous issues, learning about the 2S LGBTQ plus issues and for inclusion. I think, especially as public servants, we have a responsibility to do the work ourselves. There's no how-to guide. There's no perfect way to do it. There's no, this is how you be anti-racist. This is how you be inclusive. Take the time when you're writing your interview questions or you're designing your selection process. It's like Sancho was saying, are you really trying to hire somebody who's capable for the competencies or the job description that you're putting on the poster? Or are you sitting there and you're choosing somebody and you're asking questions to see, would this person respond a certain way? Is this the person I want to have a beer with? And if you can start taking a step back and start asking yourself questions like, okay, this is who I'm trying to screen in, but who could potentially be screened out with me behaving or acting, asking questions like this? What are the ramifications? It's a two-sided sword, so to speak. And I think if people take the time to start looking at things outside of their own experience and attempting to be empathetic, then I think there's going to be, by all means, refer to the guides, but you can also talk to your colleagues. I'm sure Sancho's not going to bite your head off if you shoot him an email and ask questions. There are so many resources, there's so many people. And I think if we start taking the time to build teams that are actually diverse, and we're not just hiring somebody because they look like us, they act like us, they have the same experience as us, then by default, we're going to start having diverse teams. And we're going to stop having these issues where when we finally hire somebody that's different, there is this issue with them fitting in. We have to be less about fitting in and more about, okay, this person is different and that's okay. And I value that difference that they bring to the table. So I just think we have to stop, especially for me coming from an angle in terms of anti-racism since 2020. I get this question all the time. Where's the resources? Where can I go? How can I be anti-racist? I think if you can just take the time and do some research, look at what has resulted in the situation, the system that we currently have, I think it's kind of self-explanatory what we need to do things differently, right? It's cause and effect. If we know what we have done for the past 100 or so years to result in a public service that's not very inclusive, then I think it kind of makes sense that if we try to ask questions a little bit differently and be open to different and new approaches, check our privilege at the door, and just be willing to learn about other communities, learn about people that are different than ourselves. And I think by default, if you take the time to that learning and to reach out and to learn about different people, then I think when you start to craft your questions and your interview questions and whatnot, you'll automatically be doing it from a different perspective and know not to exclude people. So I would challenge everybody to take the time and to try and do that self-learning. And I think that will help when it comes to having more inclusive selection processes and teams.
Thank you, Nicole. So thank you everyone for your comments, for your questions, for attending this session. Before we end today's event, the CAN National Office would like to sincerely thank the panelists for their time and openness during this discussion. We would like to take a moment to thank our moderators, Jeremy and Tony, and the team at Statistics Canada who helped organize this event and facilitate this panel. We greatly appreciate your support and guidance in preparing for today's event. We'll be sharing a link to our feedback form in the chat, and we ask that you please take a moment to fill it out to help us keep developing and improving these events. Thank you all for your attending today. And if you have any questions and want information about getting involved in CAN, please don't hesitate to contact the national office at can@carleton.ca. We'll share this email address in the chat as well. And we have our CAN Connect forum for April coming up on April 23rd, and we'll share the registration link in chat. Please register and join our next event. Tony, would you like to close with a note?
I want to thank you as well, Mastur, and the team at Carleton University. I also want to echo what you said about the panelists and Jeremy's facilitation. I think we should all applaud virtually for what we heard today and the great testimonials that we heard. Je pense que on a appris aujourd'hui que
I think that today we've learned anything is possible and that we must never cease to look at real and positive opportunities. There can be real, authentic inclusion, and that moves us forward.
attended this session. I want you to reflect on what you learned today and maybe give you a bit of an homework to speak to one, two, or maybe three people about what you heard today and share the message. So this becomes a blooming effect so that we have more and more allies, more and more interest in making sure that we have a more accessible, more inclusive Canadian economy and society. So thank you all very much. Thanks to the organizers and most of all, thanks to Jeremy and the panelists. It's been a dream for a while between me and a few others that we would organize this. I'm still sorry that I missed the first part, but it made me see how Jeremy can shine and be agile, and all the organizers as well. Merci beaucoup. Et à bientôt.
Merci,
Thank
Tony.
you all, and see you next time.
Thank you to our panelists. It was amazing. Thank you.